الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Now, so moving on, alhamdulillah, now we've completed all of the preliminary discussions that are meant to be held before we actually enter into what we call sulbul kitab or sulbul ilm, the actual discussions that are the primary discussions, most important discussions of this ilm itself. And as we mentioned previously, the adilla muttafaq alayha, there are four proofs that are considered muttafaq alayha: Quran, Sunnah, or Kitabullah, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. And the way the discussion amongst the Hanafiya is that they begin with, of course, al-bahth al-awwal fi kitabillah. Now over here, just an ishara, the tariqatul jumhur, in their tariqa, they don't necessarily divide the discussions right off the bat, focusing on Kitabullah, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. What I mean by that is that before all of that, they have a discussion or they have discussions regarding Dalalatul Alfaad. Right. And this is, in reality, Dalalatul Alfaad. Right. What is the implications of the words in the Arabic language from an Arabic perspective and from a rational perspective as well? This discussion is something beyond just the Quran and the Sunnah. In reality, the alfaz of Arabic are used in both the Quran and the Sunnah. The alfaz of Arabic are used in both the Quran and the Sunnah. So really, the discussions that are held in Dalalatul Alfaad apply to both the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay. So they start off with talking about Dalalatul Alfaad. In Dalalatul Alfaad, there are four main discussions that are the most important: Khāṣṣ, Am, Amr, and Nahi. These are the four most important discussions. And then there's further discussions that are held that are also of importance. But these are the four most important discussions. For example, other than this, they talk about haqiqa and majaz, right? And there's other discussions that they hold as well. But these four are the most important ones that pertain to Dalalatul Alfaad. So they first talk about all of these discussions individually. So in Dalalatul Alfaad, for example, they start off in Dalalatul Alfaad and they'll have an entire chapter just on a khas. And then they have subheadings. Subheadings under the discussion of khas, they have a number of discussions. Then they have am, and then they have subheadings. Under the discussion of am, they have a number of discussions. Then you have amr, then you have subheadings. Under the discussion of amr, you have a number of discussions. And nahi, and then you have subheadings. Under the discussion of nahi, you have a number of discussions. Like one by one, like this. This is how it is. Dalalatul Alfaad. Number one, let's talk about khas. Let's talk about am. Let's talk about amr. Let's talk about nahi. Sometimes they might even start with amr and nahi. They don't even start with am and khas, because amr and nahi are even more important than am and khas. So they start off with that. In the middle, they'll mention, for example, mutlaq, muqayyad, haqiqa, majaz. All of this stuff that has to do with Dalalatul Alfaad, they talk about it before. Then they have a discussion on Quran. Like after finishing the entire discussion on Dalalatul Alfaad, which is pretty much, 1/3 of the book. Then they go to Kitabullah, or if not even more sometimes. Then they go to Kitabullah. In Kitabullah, they have basic discussions, like what is the definition of Kitabullah, the definition of Nasikh, Mansukh, and basic discussions that might not pertain to Alfaad directly or that have nothing to do with Arabic, but they have to do with the Quran. Okay. Then they go to the Sunnah, likewise, basic discussions regarding the Sunnah. The way the Hanafiya, the tariqah of the Hanafiya, the way they organize these discussions is that in their book, they start off by saying al-bahth al-awwal fi kitabillah. The first bahth they have is regarding the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when they start talking about the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the entire discussion that is meant to be held in Dalalatul Alfaad, right? This entire discussion is held where amongst the Hanafiya? In al-bahth al-awwal fi kitabillah. Okay. So literally they'll say we'll start off with باعتبار الوضع, then باعتبار البيان, then باعتبار الاستعمال, then باعتبار الدلالة. Like literally the entire discussion that normally in the books of Jumhur you'd have in Dalalatul Alfaad, one chapter after the other, that entire thing is categorized in sub-chapters within the discussion of al-bahth al-awwal fi kitabillah. And then in the beginning of al-bahth al-thani fi sunnah, the Ahnaf will be like, oh, all of that also applies over here. All of what you studied over there also applies over here because it's the Arabic language at the end of the day. This is the tariqah that the Hanafiya organized it. So it's a very distinct method. Okay, basically what this means is that if you're trying to overlap these discussions and you want to, for example, look into one of these discussions of Khāṣṣ and Am in one of the books of Jumhur, you wouldn't go to Kitabullah, like the bahth regarding Kitabullah. You would go to that discussion. That discussion in of itself will have its own title or chapter heading. And you'll find that in Dalalatul Alfaad, which is mentioned after they mention their muqaddimat, they will start off with Dalalatul Alfaad, then they go into Amr and Nahi and Khāṣṣ and Am. This is a general outlook. Yes, them themselves as well. It's not like Tariqatul Jumhur, all of them agreed on the tartib. Like they didn't all agree on exactly one exact method of organizing the discussions. They also differed amongst each other in certain regards. But generally, this is what you're going to find. طيب. البحث الأول في كتاب الله. We start off over here. The definition of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is Kitabullah? We say هو القرآن المنزل على الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم المكتوب في المصاحف المنقول عليه عنه عليه السلام نقلا متواترا بلا شبهة. What is the definition of the Kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now this is really important. Before we even talk about the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and everything it entails inside, it's really important to talk about the definition of the Kitab of Allah to begin with. So number one, we say, what is the Kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When we say Kitabullah, are we referring to all of Kalam Qadim? The answer is no. Okay. By saying Al-Quran al-Munazzal ala al-Rasuli sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, what have we removed? We have removed the Kalam Qadim of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which was Munazzal, which was revealed upon the previous prophets. So Kalamullah, right? If you just said Kalamullah or Kitabullah in general, okay, that would entail the Torah. That would also entail the Injil. That would also entail the Zabur. It would also entail the Suhuf that were revealed upon the previous prophets. All of this is entailed. Okay, so by saying Al-Quran, number one, Al-Quran over here is synonymous with Kalamullah. You can say Al-Quran al-Munazzal or Kalamullah al-Munazzal ala Rasul. By adding this clause of al-Munazzal ala Rasuli sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, what are we removing? We're removing the rest of the books that were revealed, the Kalam Qadim of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which was revealed upon the previous prophets. طيب. Then we say al-maktubu fil masahif. This is really important. What is the benefit of adding this clause, al-maktubu fil masahif? The Quran, which was revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Kalam of Allah Qadim, which was revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, went through different stages. And what I mean by that is that there was a concept or there's a possibility of Nasikh, abrogation, which could take place. So there is a Kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which was revealed. And that could have possibly been abrogated, meaning the entire ayah could have been removed. And that's why when you look at the books of tafsir, they'll mention that Surah Al-Ahzab used to be in the length of Surah Al-Baqarah. But then there was Nasikh that occurred, there was abrogation that occurred, and so on and so forth. So the actual Kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which was, if we simply stopped at Al-Munazzal ala Rasuli sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this would entail Nasikh as well as Mansukh. Okay, this would entail all of it. So by adding the clause of Al-Maktubu fil Masahif, what have we removed? We've removed every single ayah that was revealed upon which the Ijma' of the Sahaba did not occur. Because in the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the Sahaba, they got together, or he created a Lajna, a committee, and there was an Ijma' of these companions upon the fact that what was gathered in the Masahif at that time, that they gathered, the Lajna gathered, that is 100% the Kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran of Allah upon which the Messenger passed away sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now, there's a really important point over here, and this inshallah will remove a lot of doubt regarding this whole process. The Quran was revealed upon sab'at ahruf. What does that mean? The ulama differed regarding what that means. Number one, 100% it's not the qira'at, it's something else. However, there was also nasakh that took place every now and then. The problem or the reason why people misunderstand or they draw wrong conclusions when it comes to this entire discussion is because they are assuming that every single companion knew every single verse which was meant to always remain in the Quran and which was abrogated from the Quran, and they also knew all of the sab'at ahruf. And this is a mistake. This is where the problem and the doubts start from. It's not necessary that all the companions knew all of the ahruf. In fact, the reality is that all the companions did not know all of the ahruf. That's the whole purpose of the ahruf. The Messenger used to teach the harf to a companion which he felt was munasib for that companion, depending on where he came from and how he used to recite, and what would be easier for him. That's the harf the Messenger would teach to him. What that means is that the companions themselves, they differed in their understanding of the ahruf. or their reciting of the ahruf. And not all of them knew that the other one was a harf. Okay, in fact, some of them wouldn't even know that there's another harf. This same verse that I'm being taught can actually be recited in a different harf. That's number one. Number two is there was nasikh that took place. It's not necessary that all of the companions knew exactly what became mansukh and what didn't become mansukh. A companion might have heard the ayah of the Quran from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Does that mean he knows that later on it became abrogated? And the Messenger came and clarified to every single companion that this became abrogated? The answer is no. The answer is no. So because of this, what you will find now in the earlier times, meaning in the time of the Sahaba, is that you will find some companions that are still teaching ayat mansukha, which is what happened. There were still companions that were still teaching ayat mansukha, and there's companions that are teaching different ahruf to the people that are their disciples or their disciples in the different lands that they go to. So there's some companions, for example, they went to Sham. There's some companions that went to Iraq. There's some companions that went, east, west, Misr, in different places. And wherever they went, they taught what they had studied from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But again, going back to the point where they might possibly could have been teaching things which were mansukh, and they also possibly could have been teaching ahruf, for example, that might have also become mansukh. All of this was a possibility and a reality that actually occurred. And this is why the khilaf happened. And because of this, Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he commanded that a lajna be prepared. And the goal of that lajna, ahbab, was not to do nasikh or abrogate ahkam and so on and so forth. It was to gather the 100% certain part or certain kalam that the messenger, when he passed away, it was meant to be from the Quran. That was the gharad, that was the goal of the lajna, and nothing else. واضح. طيب. Now there's a khilaf whether Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu wanted to keep all of the ahruf within the Masahif or not. And this khilaf is غير مضر. Regardless of which opinion you hold, which is that all of the ahruf ended up in the Masahif or they didn't end up in the Masahif in the end, it doesn't matter. Okay, and the way to understand this is, think of, for example, the ahruf are like a utensil, and the water is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same water you can put it in different cups, different utensils, different shapes. Now, simply because I took this water and put it into a different shape or different cup, for example, it's still the same water. It's just in a different presentation. It's a different presentation. Like, if the whole gharad is to keep the water, let's say there's 7 different types of cups, different forms, different shapes. Okay, and there's a little bit of that water in all 7 of them. Or all that water I can put in all 7 interchangeably. Let's say I lose 6 of these cups and I only have 1 left. Have I lost the water? The answer is no. So even if the ahruf were to actually, the whole purpose of ahruf was taysir ala nas, to make it easier for people. Even if we say the ahruf were lost, that does not entail abrogation. That is not nasikh. Why is it not nasikh? Because the water is still completely mawjood. It's still completely present. So the ahruf, whether you hold the opinion that all of the 7 ahruf were included in the masahif that were gathered in time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, or we don't hold that opinion, we say no, some ahruf were lost in the process, or portions of ahruf, for example, were lost in the process. Regardless, it doesn't matter. The entire Quran is still preserved because the Quran is the water. The kalam is the water, not the utensil. That's number 1. Number 2, Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, could he intentionally impose upon everyone? Impose upon everyone. Not from the perspective of this is the deen, and this is not, it's not permissible for you to pray in any other or recite in any other way. But for the purpose and the maslahah of uniting the ummah, because the illah for taysir was no longer there. Could he impose upon everyone to read only what's in line with the masahif, even if there were certain ahruf that are not found in those masahif? The answer is he can. Because again, this is not changing the Quran. This is understanding that the whole illah for why there were 7 cups, 7 cups were revealed after one was revealed. The whole purpose for that was taysir ala nas. It was to make it easier for people. And that illah no longer exists because Islam has expanded far and wide and people are learned now. They learned the different ways that the Arabic language can occur and work, and they learned the lugha of Quraysh. And because ta'aleem spread, now we no longer have the need of taysir ala nas. Okay, so even if Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu imposed upon everyone to only follow what was in the masahif, which let's say for example it only entails 1 harf and doesn't entail the rest of them, and he actually imposed that don't read according to any other harf, only read according to this harf. That too, ahbab, is not nasakh. It's not considered abrogation of anything. It's not actually an abrogation. It's considering the ijaza, the permissibility for reading in the multiple ahruf, mu'allal with taysir, and that is mansus ali. Yani the fact that this was the reason why the messenger wanted multiple ahruf is found in nas itself. And the messenger himself requested Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reveal the multiple ahruf to make it easier for people. So what does this teach us? It teaches us that the illah for the revelation of multiple ahruf was taysir al nas. When that illah is no longer present, no longer does a person need to recite in the multiple ahruf in order to recite the Quran. The Quran is still completely preserved even if it's only in one harf. This is if you take this opinion that in the Masahif of Uthman he only kept one harf. Okay, if you take the opinion that there's multiple ahruf that are present in the Masahif of Uthman, then you wouldn't have this issue to begin with. طيب. Now, based on this first opinion though, that the Masahif only entail one harf, based on this understanding now, whether you find in Sahih Bukhari a hadith wherein Aisha radiallahu anha, for example, she says that when the messenger passed away, this ayah was recited from the Quran, خَمْسُ رَضَعَاتٍ يُحْرِمْنَا, okay, or whether you find, for example, Sahaba, for example, in their qira'at, they're saying, فَثَلَاثَةُ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَالِيَاتٍ, right, فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَالِيَاتٍ, for example, they're adding مُتَتَالِيَات, or اللَّهُ نُورُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ مَثَلُ نُورِ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ كَمِشْكَاةٍ فِيهَا مِصْبَاحٌ, they're adding مَثَلُ نُورِ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ, not مَثَلُ نُورِهِ, right? And you have all this other, for example, qira'at shadha that now we call that are not in line with the Masahif of Uthman radiallahu anhu. Finding this in the authentic narrations is only supporting the narrative that I just mentioned. It's actually meant to be the case. This is not, and this wouldn't indicate that the Quran was not preserved. Rather, the opposite. It is in line with the method of preservation of the Quran. Okay, this is the beauty of understanding this properly. Sometimes there's misunderstandings, and because there are misunderstandings regarding the way the Quran was preserved, there are conclusions that are drawn that are totally factually incorrect. Okay, when you understand the actual way the Quran was preserved, even if you found, for example, in certain manuscripts, or you found, for example, certain Sahaba, in certain ahadith, that they were reciting even after the Messenger passed away, they were teaching, for example, ayat, for example, that are in a way different compared to what the Mus'haf has. None of this goes against the narrative we just mentioned. It makes sense that some Sahaba would be doing that. Okay, when does it become binding as the kalam of Allah? This is the question, right? Not fulan naqala kada an al-Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam فصار من كلام الله. That's not enough for it to become binding. Okay, just the fact that one Sahaba you found in a hadith that he was teaching so and so, that is not enough for it to become binding as the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question we have is, when does it become binding as the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Not could possibly it have been recited in the time of the Messenger or not. Okay, there's no ishkal. There could be many things that were recited in the time of the Messenger, but when does it become binding as the kalam of Allah? For that you need ijma'. For that you need ijma'. And that ijma' did not occur upon these individual ayat. That ijma' occurred upon what was written down in the Masahif. That's why in the end we say what was written down in the Masahif, that is 100% the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mujma' alayh kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is it possible some ahruf that were also from the kalam of Allah could still not be found in those Masahif? The answer is yes, and that does not mean it's nasikh, it's not abrogation, it's not taking away from the kalam of Allah in any way. The entire kalam of Allah is still preserved, it's still present, even with the existence of those separate ahruf, for example, in certain ahadith and so on and so forth, that could have existed. It could also be mansukh. Okay, one thing's for sure is that what was written in the Masahif, that 100% is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the way you understand this concept, and inshallah ta'ala, there's more elaboration I can give, but we'll suffice with that for now. Through this understanding, all of the ishkalat inshallah ta'ala will be removed. طيب. So we say al-maktubu fil masahif, that kalam which was written down in the Masahif in the time of Uthman. Al-manqulu anhu alayhi salam naqlan mutawatiran bila shubha. It was transmitted from the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam naqlan mutawatiran bila shubha. طيب, now that it's been written down in the Masahif, right? It was compiled in the Masahif. The naql of it is occurring by way of tawatur, because these Masahif were sent where? To the 7 amsar. Some say 5, some say 7. There's different opinions on how many cities and how many Masahif they were, but they were sent all around the Muslim world. And they were the Mus'haf, like for example, the Mus'haf of the people of Kufa, that is the Mus'haf that everyone from the Qurra of the Kufa would resort to when they would teach. So now, because these Masahif were spread across the Muslim world, they are transmitted without any shubha. Naqlan mutawatir. طيب, why does it say mutawatir bila shubha? Because according to Jassas al-Razi, he uses the terminology of mutawatir bish shubha and mutawatir bila shubha. Mashhur, according to him, is mutawatir bish shubha. So over here, we're not saying mashhur is not enough. Shuhra is not enough to establish the Qur'aniyya of a verse, that the verse is from the Quran. Rather, the tawatur has to be by way of a tawatur which is with no shubha. Like, this is the definition of Kitabullah. This is what we refer to when we say Kitabullah. The first entire discussion that the Hanafiya have is regarding the Kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. Tanbih. This is really important. Tanbih. Now. طيب. اعلم أن للأصوليين مناهج مختلفة في ترتيب وعرض المسائل الأصولية، وقد ابتكر أبو زيد الدبوسي منهجا مختلفا. The Uṣūliyun have different ways to present the Mabahith Uṣūliyya. Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, he came up with a very specific method of presenting the Mabahith Uṣūliyya. Okay, he took the Mabahith of Uṣūl in Kitabullah and divided them, meaning the Dalalatul Alfaad. Really, was this referring to his Dalalatul Alfaad? Which Mabahith of Uṣūl did he take? طيب, Dalalatul Alfaad. And not only actually in his actual book Taqweem al-Adillah, you find other Mabahith as well like this. But mainly the Dalalatul Alfaad. He took them and divided them into 4 categories, 4 aqsam. تحت كل قسم 4 أقسام. And under each 4 there were 4. So what that would basically mean is the Mabahith of Uṣūl are divided into 4 categories. Okay, under each is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is found under each 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? All 4 are divided into 4 categories. Okay, this was for the purpose of ease in tartib and in ard. Okay, because when you make something very organized and you have 4 by 4, then it seems like it's very organized and so on and so forth. Like, what is the benefit of dividing them in this manner? What is the benefit of dividing them and presenting them in this manner? طيب. Over here, Ibn Qutlubugha gave us the reason for this, the hikmah behind this. He said, وَاخْتَارُوا هَذَا التَّقْسِيمِ. Now, everyone after Abu Zayd al-Dabusi followed him in this taqsim. طيب, he says, واختاروا هذا التقسيم لاستغراقه الاعتبارات من أول وضع الواضع إلى آخر فهم السامع. يا سلام. Why did number one Abu Zayd al-Dabusi come up with this taqsim and then everyone follow this taqsim? Why? Because this taqsim will entail all of the different i'tibarat, all of the different discussions, from the beginning of the coinage of the one who coins, right? The wad'ul wadi', the one who coins a certain point, meaning from the beginning of when that word came into existence till the end of when that word is understood by the one who it's spoken to. So the word starts off, how does the word come into existence? Let's say the word coming into existence is at this point over here. And then it goes continuously, and then the word is used, and then eventually someone understands the word. Okay. This taqsim will entail everything that takes place from أول وضع الواضع all the way to آخر فهم السامع. كيف? He says, لأن أداء المعنى باللفظ الخارجي على قانون الوضع يستدعي وضع الواضع وجوه الوضع. Okay. Anytime you use a word to imply a meaning, to give a meaning, that necessitates that someone had to have coined that word for that meaning. Okay. So the fact that that word was coined, every single word in the language is coined. There's no doubt in this. So the fact that that word was coined, for a specific meaning, what does that tell us? That tells us that we have to look at the methods through which that word could be coined. We have to look at the methods through which that word could be coined. طيب. That is وجوه الوضع. ثم دلالته أي كونه بحيث يفهم منه المعنى. طيب. Now that the word is coined, are all words coined in the same form of clarity? The answer is no. Some words are more clear in their meaning, some words are less clear in their meaning. And this has to do with the meaning of the word itself. This doesn't have to do with how you use the word. It has to do with the meaning of the word itself. So what comes second after wujuhul wada' is wujuhul bayan, because wujuhul bayan has to do with the clarity of the word. ثم استعماله, then that word is used, but that word could be used in different ways. Okay, so number one, a word can be coined for one meaning or can be coined for multiple meanings. Right, a word can be coined in a specific way, it can be coined in a generic way. Then number two, it can be clear versus unclear. Then number 3, it's used either literally or metaphorically, right? In different ways it can be used. And then number 4, how is it understood? How does it imply its meaning? ثم وجوه الاستدلال فهي مراحل تمر بها الألفاظ. So in reality, these are simply steps. The lafaz goes through these steps from the beginning of its existence until the end of its usage. Ya salam. And what are the steps? The steps are such. You start off with وجوه الوضع. In what forms can the word be coined? What does وجوه الوضع mean? The different forms that the word can be coined in. There's multiple different forms. Second step is وجوه البيان. How clear is the word? Meaning after you determine how it was coined, how clear is it? The third step is وجوه الاستعمال, right? When the word was used, in what sense was it used? And the fourth step would be وجوه الدلالة. When the word is understood, in what way is it understood? In what form is it being understood? So these are marahil. It goes, so you start off with وجوه الوضع. How can the word be coined? What ways can it be coined? Then you go to how clear is it, for example, from linguistic perspective. Then you go into how was it used by the one who used it, and then you go into how can you extract the meaning from it, or how can it be understood by the one who understands it. And these are very logical, chronological order. Like it makes sense for وجوه الوضع to come first, then وجوه البيان to come second, then وجوه الاستعمال to come third, and then وجوه الدلالة to come fourth. Okay. So we say وسار الحنفية في عرضهم للمسائل الأصولية على هذا التقسيم. The Hanafiya like this way that Abu Zayd al-Dabusi presented it, and they continued upon this method. طيب, we're going to briefly mention all of them all together. Okay. الأول في وجوه النظم وضعا وهي أربعة. Okay, the first one is وجوه الوضع. What is وجوه الوضع? What are the ways the word can be coined? What are different ways the word can be coined? They said there's 4 categories: خاص, عام, مشترك, and مؤول. Okay. Number 2 is وجوه البيان لذلك النظم وهي أربعة. How clear is the word? Okay. Now, there are 4 categories: ظاهر, نص, مفسر, and محكم. Now, these 4 categories are the levels in clarity. It could be ظاهر in clear, and then it could be نص, it could be مفسر, and محكم, which is very clear. The opposite of this are also levels in ambiguity. So, which would be like unclear. It could be خفي, مشكل, مجمل, and متشابه. These are opposites of the first 4. Okay. These are opposites of the first 4. Like all of this so far, everything we've mentioned so far, all of this has to do with not how the one who uses the word uses it, but linguistically, the linguistic implication of the word. Number 1, how many meanings was it coined for? Number 2, how clear is it? Is it clear? Is it unclear? If it's clear, what level of clarity? If it's unclear, what level of unclarity? Okay. طيب. Number 3, now there's a question which is that the wujuh al-bayan only have to do with the wording itself and not contextual usage. No, it can do with contextual usage as well. It can overlap with contextual usage. But by default, the real form of clarity versus unclarity has to do with the word first. First, we look at the word, and then we look at the usage. Okay, so it can overlap, but by default, like the word linguistically can also have a degree of ambiguity within it. Okay, like the word which is, for example, mujmal, right? This word, why is it mujmal? From a linguistic perspective, it's not a matter of how was it used and so how was it not used. Literally from a linguistic perspective, mutashabih is mutashabih from a linguistic perspective before you even use it. So by default, wujuh al-bayan has to do with linguistically how clear is it. Then context can also cause a lack of clarity or a lack of unclarity as well. Okay. Then you have وَالثالث في وجوه الاستعمال. How do you use that word? So now that we figured out linguistically how was the word coined, and likewise linguistically how clear is it or how unclear is it, how can we use that word? Because that word can be used literally, it can be used metaphorically, it can be used explicitly, it can be used implicitly. طيب. And then the fourth is وجوه الوقوف على المراد والمعاني. How can you understand the meaning of the word as the listener after it has been used? And that could be by way of عبارة النص or إشارة النص or دلالة النص or اقتضاء النص. So this order, starting off with وجوه الوضع, then وجوه البيان, then وجوه الاستعمال, then وجوه الوقوف على المراد والمعاني, or وجوه الاستعمال, وجوه الدلالة. This order is a naturally understood order. It makes sense for it to start off with, let's start off talking about وجوه الوضع, then talk about وجوه البيان, then mentioning وجوه الاستعمال, then mentioning وجوه الدلالة. It makes sense to start off like this. طيب, interestingly, أحباب, in مبادئ الأصول, and him following أصول الشاشي, the order is not like this. In مبادئ الأصول, وجوه البيان, and following أصول الشاشي, he did this, comes number 3, and وجوه الاستعمال comes as number 2. Okay, that's the way it's been ordered where in Mabadi al-Uṣūl and Uṣūl al-Shashi. In our work, we flipped it. Meaning we're going to keep wujuh al-bayan as number 2, and we're going to keep wujuh al-isti'mal as number 3 because this is the correct way to present it. This is the way that was adopted by majority of the Hanafiya, and this is the way that it makes more sense. Because you're thinking about it from this perspective. Wujuh al-wada' comes first, the word is coined first. Then we look at clarity, okay? Then we look at how it was used. And then we finish off with looking at the final, which is how we can understand the meaning. طيب. So التقسيم الأول باعتبار الوضع. طيب, another important point before we begin over here, starting with باعتبار الوضع, which is that when you divide it from this category, so basically, if we look at the chart we made, now you have 4, and then in each 4 you have 4. Are we trying to suggest that there's no overlapping between this? The answer is no. This is incorrect. These are 4 marahil, these are 4 stages that the word will go through. So every word, when you determine, for example, whether it's khas, am, mushtarak, or mu'awwal, طيب, every word from that, like once you determine where it falls in that category, then you have to determine whether it's lahir, nas, mufassir, or muhkam. Like you will next determine the clarity of it. Then you will determine how it was used, the same word. Was it used haqiqatan or majaz, right? And then you will determine in the end how you understand the meaning from it, by way of ishara or ibara. Like, so we're not trying to say that once a word falls under one category, it can never fall into the second category. No, it has to fall into the second category. The word after it falls under one category, after you determine whether it's khas or am, you go where, okay, now was it used, or was it lahir, or was it nas? And then you go where, okay, was it used haqiqatan or was it used majazan? Then you go where, okay, how are you understanding the murad? Is it by way of ishara or dalala? Like, not only that, even within one mabhath, so within wujuh al-bayan, khas, am, mushtarak, and mu'awwal, even a word can overlap and actually fall under multiple categories, even within one category. Okay, the word which is khas, okay, can also be mushtarak. A word which is khas can also be mushtarak. Okay, meaning initially it was for 2 meanings. We specified one meaning, it became mu'awwal. Okay, and that one meaning was khas and it wasn't am. That's possible, right? So these are different perspectives of looking at the word. The word, we used it in the haqiqi ma'na sarahatan, ma' saraha. So it's haqiqa sarih. Or you can use it in the haqiqi ma'na lakin kinayatan. They can overlap. Like, so the point is this. Putting a word, this is just simply a method of presenting the discussions. We're not trying to suggest over here. Like normally when you have a qasim, right? These are not like the khas and am, for example. A word will either be khas or it will be am. And even in this, we're going to study that this is relative. But when we divide the word into these different categories, we're not trying to say that if it falls into one category, it means it's never going to fall into the second category. No. The word can actually fall into multiple categories. Okay, depending on how you're using it, depending on the usage of that word. One word can actually, you can actually understand from its ibara one thing, from its ishara another thing, from its iqtida another thing. The same word. You can understand it through ibara, you can understand it through ishara, you can understand it through iqtida. So by mentioning these categories, don't misunderstand and think that, okay, the moment we mention one word in one place, no longer can it fall into the second category. That's not the purpose of this categorization. It's not like the chart that we made where we said that the iqtida will either be talab or طلب الفعل or طلب الترك, and then طلب الترك will either be jazmi or غير jazmi. That was a form of a chart that was being made and a categorization where each category was distinct from the opposite category. This is not in that regard. This is not from that perspective. So each category over here is not distinct from the opposing category. طيب, let's start off with the first one. We have التقسيم الأول باعتبار الوضع. اللفظ باعتبار وضعه للمعنى على 4 أقسام. Any word from the perspective of its coinage for a meaning is one of 4 types. Al-Khas, Al-Am, Al-Mushtarak, and Mu'awwal. What does this mean? A word from the perspective of it being coined, okay, we can put that word under one of these 4. And as I just mentioned, okay, a word can actually go under multiple too. Okay, multiple of these 4 based on perspective. طيب. Starting off with Khas and Am. What is Khas? So we say, number 1, اعلم أن بحث الخاص والعام بحث مهم عند الأصوليين وذلك لكثرة ورودها لكثرة ورودهما وتأثيرهما في الأحكام ولذلك أفردهما كثير من الأصوليين ويندرج تحت هذا البحث كثير من المسائل ابتداء بالتعريف. Okay. The bahth of am and khas are very, very important discussions amongst the usuliyin. Why? لكثرة ورودهما وتأثيرهما في الأحكام. Because number one, you're not gonna find a single sentence except that it's gonna have a word which is am or khas in it, or multiple words that are am and khas. Number one, and number two, they are influential in the ahkam. These concepts are influential in the ahkam. طيب. And this is why many usuliyun, they, in their Dalalatul Alfaad, as I mentioned, Jumhur, they will have an entire chapter just called Khāṣṣ, an entire chapter just called Am, and then they have subheadings and sub discussions underneath each of these chapters. And so there's a lot of masail they hold under Khāṣṣ, there's a lot of masail they hold under Am. The first thing they start off with is the ta'rif. What is the definition of Khāṣṣ? What is the definition of Am? طيب, whenever we define something now, you define it, number one, linguistically, and then you define it istilahi, from the islahi perspective. Okay. Now, again, when you study mukhtasarat, if you open, for example, Uṣūl al-Shashi doesn't define it linguistically. He just goes straight to the islahi definition and he gives the hukum. Because the gharad over there is ikhtisar. The gharad over there is ikhtisar. And because there's shadid ikhtisar, do we really need to focus on the linguistic meaning? Maybe not. Like, it doesn't really matter what it means linguistically. Who cares? Like, our gharad is the islahi ma'na, so let's just mention the islahi ma'na. طيب. Do we really need to give examples? Not really. Examples are good if they're there, alhamdulillah. If they're not there, like, who really cares? Know the definition, know the hukum. How do we treat this type of word? That's it. That's all he does. And then he gives examples of how it influences ahkam. Okay, but as I suggested before many times, for a talib al-ilm who wants to gain ta'sil in this ilm, okay, if you did all of it, it would be better for you. If you actually went through the linguistic definition, then you went through the islahi definition, then you went through examples, and you started, like, it became practical for you, you applied it, you've seen it come to life, okay, and then you understand the hukum, meaning how do we deal with a word if it's this type of a word, and we understand the implications of that using furu', this process would be better. With that elaboration, it would be better and it would be more digestible for the student. طيب. So we start off, we say, linguistically, what is the definition of khas, the word khas? So this is an ism fa'il from khassa. Khassa, which is muda'af. Muda'af meaning you have two letters that are repeated. Sad and sad. Kha, sad and sad. طيب. This is the linguistic meaning. ثم صار علما منقولا على هذا الباب من أبواب الفقه. Then this word, which is khas, became a term regarding this chapter of the chapters of Uṣūl al-Fiqh. So it really just becomes a term for a chapter of the chapters of Uṣūl al-Fiqh, which is باب الخاص. قال ابن فارس في الصاحب في فقه اللغة الخاص الذي يتحلل فيقع على شيء دون أشياء. What is khas? Something which is limited, meaning it only applies to one thing, it doesn't apply to multiple things. Okay, so the literal definition in English of khas, guys, what is it? It's specification. So when you specify something, it becomes specific. You're only applying, or the discussion is only applying to that one specific thing as opposed to multiple things. That is the linguistic definition of khas. طيب. What is the istilahi definition of khas? We say the istilahi definition of khas. الخاص لفظ وضع لمعنى معلوم أو لمسمى معلوم على الانفراد. Okay. Khas is that word which was coined for a known meaning. Okay. أو لمسمى معلوم, or for a known thing. على الانفراد, individually. Okay. There are concepts that a person has, right, in the mind, and there are tangible things that exist outside. Okay. You have words that indicate upon those tangible things, right? A building, for example, let's say you call it a certain type of a building. You give it a name, a masjid, a house. Okay. Likewise, for example, you have a book, you have a cup, for example. These are tangible things that you can see outside. Then there's concepts in the mind, right? There's concepts that you can experience or you think of in the mind. They don't have any tangible, like as a physical thing, they don't exist outside, but the concept itself is given a term. The word khas, you can coin a word to specify a concept as well as you can coin a word to specify a physical thing outside, that exists outside. Lakin the condition is ala al-infirad. When you're using that word, you are indicating specifically upon that concept or upon that thing, individually. And you're not indicating upon multiple things or multiple concepts. This is the main point in the term khas. Okay? That's indicated upon the meaning of a word, ala al-infirad. Now, in later levels, inshallah, we'll go through a lot more detail regarding these definitions. We'll compare bi'idhnillahi ta'ala in Uṣūl al-Shashi and other books. We'll compare definitions mentioned by different scholars. For now, what's important beyond the words is to understand the concept. Anytime you find a degree of something being specific in your mind, when you hear the word, that is a word which is being used in the sense of it being used as khas, as opposed to am. طيب, tanbih. This is an important point. الخاص والعام نسبيان فقد يكون اللفظ خاصا باعتبار وعاما باعتبار آخر. Really important over here. These terms of khas and am, like generality versus specificness, these are actually relative terms. Why are they relative? The reason they are relative is because one word can be thought of from different perspectives. One word can be thought of from different perspectives. How do we understand this? You have the concept of a jins and naw', right? And fasl. Now, these are mantiqi terms. And inshallah, in the later levels, we're going to elaborate on this a lot more because according to the Uṣūliyun, the definition of jins, naw' and fasl is actually distinct. It's different from the definition of the manatiqa of jins, naw' and fasl. That will come inshallah in the later level. We're not going to talk about that right now. For now, just understand it this way. A jins is like a category. You have a category. So we're going to put jins up here. Then that category has subcategories. Right? These are anwa'. The anwa' are like the subcategories. So like you have first naw', and then you have the second naw', and then you have a third naw', etc. And then each of these anwa', under them you will have individuals. You will have afrad. Right? Afrad are like individuals. Fard 1, fard 2. Okay, over here we can put fard. Fard number 1, fard number 2, and so on and so forth. Under each of the anwa'. Okay. A simple example of this is you have so we're going to make the same chart over here with actual terms. You have insan. Insan, humans, that is a category. Under insan, you have two genders. So you have dhakar, which is male, and you have muannath, which is, or mudhakkar and muannath, which is female. Muannath is female. طيب. Okay, under each now, under male, you have different afrad. So you have Zayd, Khalid, etc., etc. And under female, you have different afrad. You have Zainab, Aisha, etc., etc. Okay, so you have the category which is insan. You have the anwa' like male and female, and then you have the afrad Zaydan and Khalid. طيب. Now, when you use a word, that word can be looked at from different perspectives. The word insan, anytime I use the word insan, the question is, which haythiyah am I looking at that word from? So I'm using the word insan. Which perspective am I looking at the word from? I can look at this word from the perspective of it being a jins. I can also look at this word from the perspective of its afrad, like what enters under the jins. So I'm looking at the word from the perspective of what that jins entails, from the perspective of its afrad. Okay. From the perspective of it being a jins, is it one jins or is it multiple jins? Is it a specific jins or is there do you have a multitude or a number of ajnas that are being mentioned? The answer is it's one jins. So from the perspective of jins, it is one. And whenever you find one, what does that mean? Khāṣṣ. So from this perspective, it is actually khāṣṣ. But from the perspective of its afrad, if I looked at that word from the perspective of its afrad, then from this perspective you have umum. And umum is generality. Umum meaning you're entailing a multiple amount, not one amount. Okay. So the same word can actually be khāṣṣ and it can actually be am at the same time. Khāṣṣ from one perspective and am from a different perspective. So the terms of khāṣṣ and am, these are actually terms that are relative. They are terms that are relative. This is really important. Okay, we're not saying one word, if it's khāṣṣ, it can never be am. One word can be khāṣṣ and am at the same time. That's possible. Not always the case, but it's possible. Okay, because then we say the haythiyah. Okay, always remember this. This is a qaida that will help you in many ulum. Al-haythiyatu mu'tabara. Al-haythiyatu mu'tabara. The perspective, okay, is really important. It's mu'tabara. What does that mean? إذا اختلفت الحيثية اختلف الحكم. يا سلام. When we say الحيثية معتبرة, what does that mean? إذا اختلفت الحيثية اختلف الحكم. When the حيثية changes, the حكم associated with it also changes. Okay. لأن الحيثيات معتبرة, because the حيثية, the perspective, is معتبرة, it is influential. So we have over here فالإنسان خاص باعتبار الجنس عام باعتبار النوع فإنه يشمل نوعي الرجل والمرأة. Insan is khas from the perspective of the jins, but it's am from the perspective of the naw, because it entails not one naw now, it entails multiple, both the male and the female, masculine and feminine. طيب. This is an important point over here. Again, inshallah, in the later level, we will describe the difference between jins and no according to manatiq versus usuliyun. Like there's an ishkal over here, right? Which is that normally, according to manatiqa, insan is not a jins. Insan is not actually a jins according to the mantiqi terminology. So because that ishkal exists, in the later levels, inshallah, we will explain that the usuliyun, they look at a jins from a different perspective, and therefore their definition of jins is different, and their understanding of jins is different as compared to the manatiq. You know, one time I was in America, and one of my friends, his father's a mufti. He also studied in Jamia Islamiyah. And, my friend told him that, I teach usul and I teach some of the logical sciences. So the first question he asked me, he's like, what's the difference between the jins amongst the manatiq and the usuli? Like, this was his, way of assessing whether I, knew what I was talking about, or whether, do I know my stuff or not? Like, so ulama, they test you sometimes. Like, they have these very specific, interesting questions, very precise questions. And they'll ask you, like, okay, what's the difference between this and that? Just to see, like, did you actually study, or is it just, mashil hal? So sometimes these questions become important. Like, if you elaborate too much in the beginning level, then, like I said, it's going to become confusing at times. طيب. So, and moving on. والرجل خاص باعتبار النوع عام باعتبار الأشخاص فإنه يعم زيدا وبكرا وخالدا وغيرهم. Likewise, the term الرجل is specific from the perspective of it being a category of insan, but it's general from the perspective of the ashkhas, the individuals that enter under it, because al-rajul will entail all masculine men. So Bakr, Zayd, Khalid, and so on and so forth. Even Zayd, even the word fard, guys, Zayd is khas bi'atibar al-shakhs. Okay, it is am bi'atibar al-ajza, ya salam. Even the word Zayd is actually, it has umum in it, because when you say Zayd, that entails his head, it entails all of his limbs, his legs, his hands, and so on and so forth. So from one perspective, even Zayd can have generality. So what does this tell us, Ahbab? It tells us in the end that every single word, you can look at it from a general perspective, you can look at it from a specific perspective. Now the hukum will be associated based on the haythiyah that you're using it with. The hukum when we say the hukum of khas is so on and so forth, that will be associated with that word from the haythiyah that you're using that word with. طيب. What is that hukum? And when we say hukm al-khas, what that means is, if we find a word which is khas in the Quran or Sunnah, okay, what does that imply from an usuli perspective? When we say hukum, what does that mean? When you find a word which is khas in the Quran and Sunnah, what does that imply from an usuli perspective? Now, like I just said, if the word is khas from a certain haythiyah, you can also make it am. Okay, we're not talking about that haythiyah. We're saying if you find a word which is khas, and from the perspective of it being khas, what does that result in when we find that word in the Quran and Sunnah? Like, so we say, الخاص يتناول مدلوله قطعا، والمراد بذلك أن الخاص بين فلا يحتمل البيان، فإذا ورد لفظ خاص وجب العمل به لكون دلالته قطعية. طيب. All right. Now, what is the hukum of a word which is khas? We say, any word which is khas, what does madlul mean? Madlul means the meaning of that word. Linguistically, what does that word imply? Okay. Any word which is khas, that word indicates towards its madlul. يتناول مدلوله, meaning it implies its intended meaning. It indicates towards its madlul in a definitive sense. I.e., when that word is used, let's say, for example, the word rajul is used. Okay, al-rajul is used. The word al-rajul is used. When that word is used, like the word al-rajul is used, a man, right? The man. When that word is used, it's madlul, meaning whatever that word is meaning, whatever that word means, okay? The process of this word, which is simply letters, indicating upon that meaning, that is definitive. That is qat'i. That is qat'i. Meaning 100% the meaning. Okay, look, in order to understand this, every word is symbolic for a meaning. Words are simply symbolic for ma'ani. Any word you take. You say asad, for example. Asad is symbolic for a ma'na. A word, any word, is symbolic for a ma'na min al-ma'ani. Okay? The point over here is that when that word is taken, we know 100% when that word is taken, that that word is indicating upon the meaning that is meant to be symbolic for linguistically. Our knowledge that that word indicates upon that meaning is definitive knowledge. It's not speculative knowledge, right? So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, were to say that, or let's start off with a teacher. If a teacher were to say, for example, that so-and-so student, let's say the class has 25 students. I say, Zaid, go stand up outside. When you say Zaid, that word which is Zaid is symbolic for an individual, for one of the students. Okay, now let's say there's only one student that's named Zaid in the class, right? I say the word Zaid, and that word Zaid is symbolic for one of the students in the class. It's a word that indicates upon one of the students in the class. When I say the word Zaid, that word Zaid, by me saying Zaid, it's symbolic for that individual. Like this symbolism, the fact that that word is indicating upon that specific individual, this is definitive and it's not speculative. What that means is that now Zaid cannot sit there waiting, thinking that, oh, what if he meant someone else? No, he meant Zaid, 100%. Zaid cannot sit there, and neither can any other student sit there thinking, okay, what if he said Zaid, but what if he meant someone else? Like, is there bayan that can come? Is there clarity that could come that he actually meant someone else? No. He didn't mean anyone else. 100% he meant Zaid. So when we say khas يتناول مدلوله قطعا, what that means is that khas is bayin. The word which is used, which is khas, when it's used from the perspective of khusus, it is as clear as can get. And there's no possibility that someone who uses that word intended something else by way of it. You don't wait for the person to, okay, wait, could he have intended something else? No. He intended literally what that word meant. فَلَا يَحْتَمِلُ الْبَيَانِ. Therefore, there's no ihtimal. It does not have the possibility of being further clarified. It does not have the possibility of being further clarified. فَإِذَا وَرَدَ لَفْظٌ خَاصٌ وَجَبَ الْعَمَلُ بِهِ لِكَوْنِ دَلَالَتِهِ قَطْعِيَّةً. Whenever there's a word which is khas, it's necessary to act upon it because its dalala, that word's implication upon the meaning that it's meant to be representing, is a dalala qat'iyya, is a definitive implication. There's no lack of certainty. There's no waiting for further clarity. No, it is definitive. It is definitive. طيب. طيب. This is the hukum of khas, and we said لا يحتمل البيان. لا يحتمل البيان. طيب. There is a misunderstanding over here. I'm going to mention this. It's really important misunderstanding. Some people, because in Uṣūl al-Shashi, when he starts bringing examples of khas, he's contrasting it with the Shafi'iyya, like with the Shafi'i scholars. And he's saying, oh, we consider it to be qat'i in its dalala, and you don't consider it to be qat'i in its dalala. That is actually a misunderstanding. The Shafi'iyya and the Malikiyya and the Hanabila, everyone actually believes that the word khas is qat'i in its dalala. Everyone believes that the word khas is qat'i in the dalala. The khilaf with the Shafi'iyya is not whether it's qat'i in its dalala or not. It's in this discussion which is لا يحتمل البيان. Okay? Is there a possibility of further clarity or not? That is where the khilaf is. And why does this khilaf occur? The reason why this khilaf occurs is because any word, guys, any word in language can be used in a literal sense. Any word can be used in a literal sense, and it can also be used in a metaphorical sense. Like, can also be used in a metaphorical sense. And because that's the case, because any word can be used haqiqatan and majaz, any word can be used in a literal sense, and any word can also be used in a metaphorical sense. Whenever that is the case, that means whenever a word is used, even if it's clear in its meaning, even if it technically implies is symbolic for its meaning through a definitive sense, there still is an external possibility that that word might have been used metaphorically. So, for example, to understand this, let's say the teacher says, دخل الأسد. دخل الأسد. Now, normally, al-Asad, okay, is symbolic for a very specific meaning, which is a lion, right? I'm going to put over here in English. Asad, this word is symbolic for the meaning, which is a lion. Metaphorically, this word can also be used in another meaning to symbolize, meaning I'm using the word Asad to actually symbolize Zayd, who is a student. And Zayd happens to be strong, therefore I can use the word Asad to symbolize Zayd. Okay. This is using the word Asad in a majazi. This is what we call majaz, in a metaphorical sense. Okay, again, Haqi and majaz is going to come, but just understand the point over here. When I say Dakhal al-Asad, I can use the word Asad literally, which is to symbolize the lion, or I can use the word Asad metaphorically, which is to symbolize Zayd. Now, if a teacher were to say, he's sitting in the classroom, he says, well, mashallah, Dakhal al-Asad. Obviously, he's not referring to an actual lion. No lion actually entered the classroom. He's referring to a student. Right? Zayd entered the classroom, and Zayd was brave, and so he's known as Asad in the class. So he said Dakhal al-Asad. He used the word metaphorically. Okay. The word al-Asad technically is khas. The word al-Asad technically is khas. And therefore, يتناول مدلوله قطعا. The madlul over here is line. But everyone agrees, the Hanafi and the Shafi'i agree over here, that because of the qarina sarifa, because the fact that all the students are looking at, they see Zayd entering while the teacher says Dakhal al-Asad, the teacher is not intending lion, he's intending what? Zayd. So this aspect, the fact that the word can be used metaphorically, this led the Shafi'iyya to say that this word, even if it's technically khas, with all else equal, يتناول مدلوله قطعا يحتمل البيان, it can still be further clarified. It can still be further clarified. Meaning there is a degree of ambiguity. If we figure out later on that, okay, you know what was intended by that word was a metaphorical meaning and not the literal meaning, we will accept that. The Ahnaf say, the Hanafiya, their approach is that no, لا يحتمل البيان. There's no ihtimal, there's no possibility of further clarity. If there was meant to be clarity, it should have occurred simultaneous with the word. Meaning, if there was a qarina that that word was being used majazan, metaphorically, that clarity should have been given simultaneous with the word. It can never be delayed for later, and later on the clarity comes that, no, what I intended by this word was not fulan, it was actually fulan. Does that make sense? This is what they mean by لا يحتمل البيان versus احتمال البيان. طيب. That's what we see over here, تنبيه. قولنا لا يحتمل البيان هذا فرق جوهري بين الحنفية والجمهور وهو مدار كثير من الاختلافات بيننا وبين الجمهور. The fact that we say a word which is used in the sense of khas, لا يحتمل البيان, further clarity can never be given after it's used. Okay, meaning delayed from its usage. Simultaneous with its usage, yes, but delayed from its usage, no. Okay, clarity cannot be given regarding this word, delayed from its usage. This is a major difference between us and the Jumhur. Again, not the major difference is not we say it's qat'i, they say it's not qat'i. They also believe it's qat'i. The point is there ihtimal of bayan delayed? Okay, and what this really is, what bayan are we talking about over here, guys? We're talking about that clarity, that clarification, which is delayed, mu'akhar. Okay, which is delayed, which means that at the time of its usage, there was no qarina of majaz. At the time of its usage, there was no qarina of majaz. Later on, there could have been clarity, which someone mentioned. That, according to Hanafiya, is not clarity. That is actually overriding the initial statement. According to Jumhur, this is, there's ihtimal of majaz always, in any word. There's ihtimal of majaz qaim in any word. Why are the Hanafiya saying there's no ihtimal? There's two reasons the Hanafiya say there's no ihtimal. They say, look, if every single time a word is used, you say there's always a possibility that that word could be further clarified, we say that means that words now and languages have no meanings. Because you're always going to be assuming, okay, what if he intended something else? Fulan said the statement, he said what he said. Okay, what if he intended someone else? The teacher says that today you're dismissed, or today you have detention. Like he said detention, what if he meant something else? Every single time someone uses a word, every single time, if there's a possibility for further clarity, you're going to be thinking and scratching your head as, okay, what if you intended something else? Okay, so the whole purpose of the language is lost in the process. That's number one. Number two, if there is a word which is being used metaphorically, the fact that it was used metaphorically, the sign, the qarina of that has to be simultaneous with the usage of the word with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why is that the case? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands you a certain command, and literally the word means something explicitly, okay, the literal meaning of the word is something, X, Y, and Z, for example. But what Allah actually intended is something else. But He didn't clarify for you what He intended. how can you now be held accountable for doing what it literally means and for not doing what he actually intended? You can't be held accountable because you're just following what it literally means. The language means so and so, and you follow what it means. So the real reason, ahbab, that this whole khilaf occurred between the Hanafi and the Shafi'iyya, this actually goes back to mas'ala kalamiyya, which is the mas'ala of tahseen and taqbih. Ya salam. Ta'khirul bayan, ta'khirul bayan. Leaving clarity to be delayed. And this is the asal. We're going to say this interestingly, inshallah. I'll just mention it right off the bat. This same asal is going to be applied in am. This same asal is going to be applied in mutlaq muqayyad. This same asal is going to be applied in ziyada al-nas. It's going to be applied everywhere, which is that Ahnaf take the word as literal as it is, because these are words of law. And anytime there is a law which is presented, that law is followed and is binding upon the person that that law is presented to. Now, that if that law has loopholes and holes and gaps in between, and it's not clear in, like, if the word of law doesn't mean what it suggests it means, then you are actually, this is a degree of taklif ma la yutaq. You're telling people to follow something which you didn't tell them that that's what you meant for them to be following. This is why ta'khirul bayan in all of these instances, according to Hanafiya, this is why it's considered not permissible and it's not applied. Okay, now, interestingly, ahbab, both the Mu'tazila and the Maturidiyya, as we mentioned, they believe in tahseen taqbih aqli, and because they believe in tahseen taqbih aqli, they arrive at the same conclusion, which is that ta'khirul bayan is not permissible. As for the Asha'ira, they don't believe in tahseen taqbih aqli, therefore for them ta'khirul bayan is completely fine. And the entire linguistic discussion goes back to this point, which is that Ahnaf are saying when the bayan is mu'akhar, okay, bayan again is clarity. It's clarifying what you initially meant. When the bayan is mu'akhar, that is something which is taklif ma la yutaq. Because now, what that basically means is that you're telling someone that I say, for example, Zaid, you have detention. And in my mind, I'm intending Amr. But I don't tell them that I'm intending Amr. So Amr, he walks out with the rest of the class. And Zaid, he's sitting over there. The next day I call Amr, I'm like, I intended that you had intention. Why didn't you sit? So what's Amr going to say? He's like, you never said my name. How am I supposed to know you intended me? Okay. This is ta'khirul bayan. Giving clarity later on, okay, of what you use first or what you said first. That delay, why? Because when that delay occurs, then everyone has an excuse, which is that, okay, we didn't know what you intended. So the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is legislation, it's a law. This is not poetic, rhetoric. This is a law. The kalam of poems, yeah, you can have this. Poems can be ambiguous. They can have a degree of ambiguity, and maybe that increases in its eloquence in poetry. But the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is legislation. And when you have the kalam of Allah being legislation, you can't delay the clarity if it's meant to be clarified and it's not intended upon its literal meaning. طيب. So the farq jawhari between the Hanafi and the Shafi'iyya is not whether khas is qat'i or not. Everyone agrees it's qat'i. The farq jawhari is ihtimalul bayan. Is there ihtimal of bayan mu'akhar or not? The Shafi'iyya say there is ihtimal of bayan mu'akhar. The Hanafiyya say there isn't. And I also gave you the logic behind this. And this logic will stay with you forever, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? We always say, when you study a hukum fiqhi, if you study it with the ma'na, with the logic behind it, you will remember it. Studying the wisdom behind something allows you to remember the reasoning or the actual hukum. Same thing with usul. When you study the qawa'id with the logic behind them, you will remember them. طيب. If you remember, Ahbab, I said that in the Hanafi tariqah, they don't talk about the logic. That's why you're not going to find this logic being mentioned in Mabadi al-Uṣūl or in Uṣūl al-Shashi or in Manar al-Anwar. Nowhere are they going to mention the logic of why they're saying what they're saying. In Kashf al-Asrar, in the Shuruh, you're going to find it. They're going to tell you this is the logic behind it. Okay, because ta'khirul bayan is taklif ma la yutaq and X, Y, and Z. They're going to explain to you the logic behind it. But in the actual books, you don't find it being mentioned because they're mukhtasarat. And it's not meant to be mentioned. But it changes your perception completely when you understand it with the logic behind it. Like, what's an example of this? Example is, قال تعالى, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا واسجدوا. O people who believe, perform ruku and sajda. Okay. الركوع والسجود خاصان. Both the term ruku' and the term sujud, these are both words which are khas. وَمَعْنَاهُمَا بَيِّن. And the meaning of them is clear, it is explicit, it is obvious. What does ruku' mean? Ruku' means inhina. What does sujud mean? Sujud means prostration. فالركوع هو الانحناء والسجود وضع الجبهة في الأرض. What is ruku'? Ruku' simply means bowing, right? Inhina meaning bowing. And sujud is placing the forehead upon the earth, which is prostration. This is the linguistic meaning of ruku' and the linguistic meaning of sujud. Okay. And these words are khas and their ma'na is bayin. وبناء على ما ذكرنا. based on what we said. نقول الركوع والسجود لا يحتملان البيان أصلا لكونهما بينان. Both the term ruku and sujud, meaning Allah said in the Quran, O people who believe, perform ruku and perform sajda. Ruku means bowing and sajda means prostration. And these words are clear. We know what they mean. Now, could Allah intend a very specific form of prostration and intend a very specific form of ruku? The answer is yes, He could. But that clarity had to have come with the initial command. This is the point. The clarity of what Allah intended had to have come with the initial command. If it didn't come with the initial command, then what's intended is its literal apparent meaning and nothing else. And the clarity that cannot come later on. That's the point. Whatever comes later on, it would actually be abrogating. If it's changing the initial command, it's actually abrogating the initial command. طيب. فإذا ورد ما ظاهره بيان فإنه عندنا بمنزلة نص معارض لهذا النص وليس بمنزلة نص مبين. يا سلام. Really important, guys. Now, initially when someone hears يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا واسجدوا, he understands the linguistic meaning of ruku', which is انحناء. طيب. Allah commands him, perform ruku' and perform sajda. He understands the linguistic meaning of ruku', which is ish al-inhina. Allah didn't intend the linguistic meaning of ruku'. He didn't intend perform normal ruku'. He intended make sure you perform ruku' in a very specific manner with i'tidal, meaning every single one of your limbs has to completely rest after you bow. Okay, so this is extra upon the linguistic meaning. That extra upon the linguistic meaning could have been intended from the beginning by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when it wasn't clarified in the beginning by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then for Allah to hold people to account for not following the extra, okay, this is what? Taklif ma la yutaq. Like that extra, let's say there's extra, and that extra came later. It came through a hadith, for example, or came through another verse, for example. Okay, that extra which comes through another hadith or another verse, we say in reality that extra is not clarifying ruku'. It's actually a contradiction to it. Because the implication of ruku' is this implication, and the implication of the extra that came later is another implication. The implication of that extra form, which is ruku', has to be with i'tidal, meaning every single limb has to fully lock in its position. The implication of that extra form is actually a contradiction to the implication of this form. Why? Because according to this form, someone might have performed ruku'. And according to that form, that ruku' did not actually occur. What does this tell us? It tells us that according to the Hanafiya, that extra information that came, that clarified how ruku' has to be performed, that is actually a direct contradiction with this initial command. Because we're going to take these initial words upon their apparent meaning. And since it's a contradiction, contradictions are fine. So Ahnaf are establishing ta'arud between the two, number one. Once ta'arud is established, okay, when ta'arud is established, therefore you apply the command of Nasikh and Mansukh. We apply abrogation. One will abrogate the other. And since we consider this Nasikh now, abrogation, we apply the conditions of abrogation. And everyone agrees in the conditions of abrogation that the two evidences, the Nasikh and the Mansukh, they both have to be in the same level of strength. They both have to be in equal strength. You can't have a word, something which is Nasikh and it's a khabar wahid, and a Mansukh is an ayah of the Quran. Khabar wahid cannot do Nasikh of the Quran ijma'an, because the level of strength is not the same. Okay, we are saying this is ta'arud because of the literal meaning that we're taking of ruku' initially, and since it's ta'arud, nasikh can occur, but that nasikh has to be ish. It has to be such that it is in the same level of strength. That separate extra information is not mubayyin, it's not clarifying what the first one meant. The Shafi'i are saying that's just clarity. The Shafi'i are saying there's no ta'arud aslan. From their perspective, there was never a contradiction. Because from the very beginning, when Allah said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu irka'u, there was a degree of ambiguity there. There was ihtimal of bayan. And therefore, if the bayan came later, that's fine. No problem. So, in reality, the Shafi'i are considering these words as if they're mujmal. Why? In what sense? In the sense that the bayan can come later. The bayan can come later, whereas the Hanafi are considering these words to be khāṣṣ and the meaning is clear. We say, وَإِذَا تَعَارَضَ النَّصَّانِ وَكَانَ فِي نَفْسِ الْقُوَّةِ يُقَدَّمُ متأخر منهما أما إذا اختلف من حيث القوة يكون الأقوى هو الأصل ويعمل بالثاني على وجه لا يتغير به حكم الأقوى. طيب, we say if the two evidences that come, one of them is the Nasikh, the other one is the Mansukh, then there's a contradiction between the two. If they are in the same level of strength, then the mutaakhir, the one that came later, that will be the nasikh, that will be the one that abrogates, and that will take precedence. But if they are different in the levels of strength, meaning one is qat'i al-thubut and the other one is dhanni al-thubut, in that situation, yakun al-aqwa huwa al-asl, the one which is qat'i al-thubut will be the asl, and the other nas will be understood in a way that it won't contradict the initial nas. Okay, ويعمل بالثاني على وجه لا يتغير به حكم الأقوى. Okay, so the hukum of the aqwa, which was the ayah, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu irka'u, that hukum remains the strongest. As for the other nas, which is suggesting ta'dilul arkan is necessary in ruku', meaning all of your ta'dil is necessary in ruku', meaning all of the limbs have to fully lock, this will not be considered such that it can modify the meaning of the initial one. Rather, we'll act upon it in a way that we still keep the initial one, the asl. So we say ta'dilul arkan, for example, is wajib or it's sunnah. As for the fard, it's simply al-inhina in ruku'. This is the way the Hanafiya approach this entire discussion. And again, like I said, all of this goes back to the fact that we will take the word as literal as possible, because ta'khirul bayan is not possible. طيب. Another example, ومثاله قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم للمسيء صلاته, or extending upon the same example, ثم اركع حتى تطمئن راكعا. You see over here, the addition of حتى تطمئن راكعا was mentioned. So an explanation of ruku' was given. We say فالاطمئنان زائد على مجرد الانحناء. The itmi'nan, the ta'dil, this is extra upon simply bowing. فعند الحنفية وجد التعارض بين النصين واختلفا من حيث القوة. According to the Hanafiya, there is a contradiction between يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا and between حتى تطمئن راكعا. That they're literally تعارض between the two. But at the same time, they're not the same in قوة. If they were in the same in قوة, we would give the mutaakhir will become nasikh, the mutaqaddim will become mansukh. They're not the same in قوة, and therefore what happens? لأن الكتاب, why are they not the same in قوة؟ لأن الكتاب متواتر والحديث ليس كذلك. The book is متواتر and the hadith is not قطعي الثبوت, it's ظني الثبوت. فكان ما ثبت بالكتاب هو الأصل فجعلنا الانحناء وهو الركوع فرض، وأما الثابت بالحديث فعملنا به على وجه لا يتغير به حكم الكتاب بأن جعلنا الإطمئنان واجبا. We made إطمئنان واجب and not فرض for this reason. So we differentiated between إطمئنان and مجرد الانحناء, so that the command by the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remained, and the command that occurred through the sunnah also remained. على وجه لا يتغير به حكم الكتاب. From this, we understand another really important point, that is a fundamental principle in all of the قواعد أصولية of the Hanafiya, which is تنزيل كل دليل منزلته. Take every single evidence and give it the level of strength that it deserves. Take every single evidence and give it the level of strength that it deserves. Don't take an evidence which is ظني ثبوت and treat it like something which is قطعي ثبوت. Don't take an evidence which is ظني دلالة and treat it like something. Give every evidence the level that it deserves and treat it accordingly. This is one of the most important qawaid upon which the Hanafiya determine their entire, or they elaborate on their discussions. طيب. أقسام الخاص. From the types of khas are al-amru wal-nahyu wal-mutlaqu wal-muqayyad. All of these are categories of khas. Okay, وبحث الأمر والنهي بحث مهم جدا وذلك لأن الأحكام مبنية على الأوامر والنواهي وسنفرد لكل منهما بابا. The discussion of amr and nahi are important. Okay, we're going to mention a specific chapter for amr and nahi, and discussion of mutlaq and muqayyad are also important. We're going to mention a specific chapter from mutlaq and muqayyad. The asal in all of it, guys, goes back to what? So amr and nahi are from examples of khas. We're going to mention amr and nahi separately. The asl in all of this goes back to ish. It goes back to one concept. That is the concept that I started off with. That when there is a word which is qat'i in its definitive, in its implication upon a given meaning, then we treat it as definitive, and there's no possibility of further clarification unless that clarification is simultaneous. This is the gharad of this. طيب. I'll end off this discussion with one interesting point. There's actually an ishkal that someone can actually hold regarding this example that I gave. Number one, we understand the concept of khas and am, but using this as an example, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu rka'u wasjudu, using this as an example, someone can actually object to it. And why can someone object to it? What if someone were to say that the term ruku' these are not terms that are khāṣṣ. I disagree that they're khāṣṣ. I actually believe that these are حقائق شرعية. And a حقيقة شرعية is مجملة by nature. Anything which is a حقيقة, like for example, what is salah? Allah says, أقيموا الصلاة. Okay, if you take the same idea over here, you say, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا واسجدوا. ركوع means انحناء. Sujud means وضع الجبهة على الأرض. طيب, Allah says, أقيموا الصلاة, establish salah. Salah linguistically means dua. That's also khāṣṣ. The word أقيموا الصلاة, linguistically, salah means dua. That's khāṣṣ. Okay. So now, therefore, any extension that comes of salah beyond dua, that's actually abrogation. So we say no. Why do we say no? We say the word salah is mujmal. It's ambiguous. And anything which is mujmal actually requires bayan. Why is it ambiguous? Because it's a haqiqa shar'iyya. Like, someone can object and say that's the same exact situation over here. Ruku' and sujood, these are haqa'iq shar'iyya. These are not literal, linguistic terms. These are terms that only sharia defines. And so they're actually mujmal. We don't want to consider them khas, we consider them mujmal. Okay. And because they're mujmal, it's possible that bayan can come later. It's possible that the clarity can come later. So this is possible, right? This objection against this example is possible. And I mentioned in the video, and I further clarify this all the time. Examples matter, right? Sometimes we'll mention examples and we'll actually say this example is maybe not the best example because you can object to this example using X, Y, and Z. Right? Someone can easily object and say, okay, aqimu salah, you didn't apply the same philosophy. You applied a completely different philosophy over there. You said the word salah is mujmal and therefore we need bayan. Okay, say the same thing over here. Ruku and sujood is mujmal and therefore we need bayan. So there is back and forth that can go. For now, we're just going to leave you with this, inshallah, thought, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, just so you understand the beauty of Uṣūl al-Fiqh. And inshallah ta'ala, this concept was understood in a very precise manner, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and it was digested, inshallah ta'ala, as well. We'll stop over here with this lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.